Well, let me thank you again for being here as we continue our study from the book of Proverbs this morning. Last week we talked about money and riches and poverty and some successful habits for managing money that we said go beyond the scope of the church, but if it's just a regular banker or a good steward of anything, there are some principles in there that you could learn. I also mentioned last week that it was tied into many times in the book of Proverbs. The idea of money is tied into the theme that we're going to explore this morning of laziness and diligence and those sorts of things. There's some really humorous passage in the book of Proverbs. We'll look at a couple of them. And one of the warnings that we talked about last week was the danger of unearned or quick, easy money. And today we learned the opposite of that, the value of working hard and accumulating things over time. There's a lot of verses that I don't have time for every week. That I often make a part of, especially this month with the study of Proverbs, part of our Tuesday and Thursday Facebook Live, and there was a couple that I had used earlier, and I thought, well, I'm going to scrap those this morning in faith and trust that you're watching those Tuesdays and Thursdays. And if you're not a Facebook person, that's okay, they're on Twitter. If you're not a Twitter person, that's okay, they're on Instagram. If you're not a Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram person, that's okay, they're on YouTube. So you will be saturated with the book of Proverbs. To be honest, I'm kind of sick of hearing and seeing myself in all those formats, but it's one of the things that I've kind of picked up over the past year as we try to do more of a digital format and content for what we're doing. The difficulty about the book of Proverbs, I have to be honest with you, is arranging it. I told Tanya yesterday, she goes, well, how did it go? I was preparing the final draft of this. And I said, well, I'm just trying to prepare the content in an interesting, exciting way. And she goes, well, how did it go? I said, well, it's prepared. So one of the struggles with arranging the stuff of Proverbs is there's a lot of things that you already know that are common to you. So I try to do, if you go to sleep, I will notice. But today I have just two principles for us and two means of applying them. And they repeat themselves over and over and over again in the book of Proverbs. So if you have a Bible, turn it to the book of Proverbs chapter 6. And any other verses that we read will be on the screen for you. But when it comes to the theme of work and diligence in the book of Proverbs, it's interesting. There are several sections that have multiple verses in a row. Whereas when we deal with other things like money, there'll be a verse in chapter 6, a verse in chapter 11, a verse in chapter 12. When it comes to this theme, particularly, there's sections that deal with that. And we're going to see a few of those this morning. And I should also say that there's quite a bit of variation depending on what Bible version that you're using and the way the verse actually reads. Now I have, as the ones that come on the screen, there could be from any multiple versions, and if you're interested in that one, I can show it to you, but I picked the one that I thought kind of best fit where the theme was going. But most of the translations capture the heart of the proverb anyway. So today's message is called Go to the Ant, and I picked that because as a younger person, I grew up in a King James church, and Proverbs chapter 6 reads, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard." And it became one of my favorite things to say to a fellow schoolmate who was slacking off in their work or something. Because we were so exposed to the King James Bible, our insults even came in King James. So we would say, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard." Now you probably recognize what that means. We're going to read those verses here in a second. But doesn't the word sluggard even sound like something that's not good? Right? If I had a student that had studied something in class and hadn't done the work or had failed the test, we would call him a sluggard, and we took great pride in that we were being biblical in calling this lazy person who hadn't done the work a sluggard. So go to chapter 6, verse 6. I don't think this is the NIV I'm reading this morning, but "Go to the ant, you sluggard, consider its ways and be wise." So now he's going to unpack for us what is it about the ant that removes him from this negative connotation of being a sluggard. Some other versions say, "You lazy fool, look at an ant." Or "Take a lesson from the ants, you lazy bones." Or another word he uses is the slacker. Warren Wiersbe tells us that this idea of the sluggard or the slothful man is mentioned at least 17 times in the book of Proverbs, which is why it gives us a week of study, because it's mentioned that often, it's worth us spending some time on it. And he says every time that it's said, nothing good is said about the sluggard. And you can just tell, even like I said, even from the tone of the word, that it's not a good thing to be called a sluggard. I ran across a phrase a few weeks ago. I think I was actually preparing for a Facebook Live. And I thought this phrase describes the sluggard perfectly. Yesterday I did nothing, and today I'm finishing what I did yesterday. I thought that is a great way to describe this person's approach to life. So let's go now to verse 7. Now that Solomon has told us to look at the ant, let's look at what he says we should notice about the ant. Verse 7, it has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest. As commentators make a note that apparently ants have no leader, which I don't know if that's true or not. I didn't study the science of the ants. If you can help me out on the entomology of the ants, that would be great. But we do know that whenever you see ants, they are almost always doing something. We know that they can carry a tremendous amount of weight given their body size. When I'm out walking on the sidewalks, I'm constantly running into ants. Sometimes they have dunes where I don't know why this is, but I intentionally try not to step on them. I did a few weeks ago, and I felt really bad about it. I don't know why. It was just, I saw it as right before I could get my foot down. The difference is that when you see an ant, I see some of you are agreeing that you try not to step on them. I just appreciate their industriousness, right? All these ants make these huge piles of dirt. The exception is, right, when they are in your house. You do not want them there, right? And you're doing whatever you can to get them out. So we realized right away that there's something worthwhile about the ant. There's something industrious about them. So that'd be our first principle today that we see here. And the way these verses 6 through 11 break down is verses 6 through 8 give us a principle, and then verses 9 through 11. And those are going to be our two principles that we're going to see again and again. But the first principle here in verses 6 through 8 is that it promotes the value and the reward of self-disciplined and future-looking work. Look at verse 8. It stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest. It just occurred to me, have you guys ever seen a Disney movie called Ants? Okay, if you haven't, you can go watch that this week and you'll see a lot of the concepts that Solomon's talking here. How about me applying Disney movies to Scripture? So you can go and do that and see that the ants, the goal of the movie is that the ants are saving up all this food so that they can make it through the winter. And that's the concept that Solomon tells us, that there's a value and a reward to working ahead, to looking towards the future, being diligent in the present so that the future will be effective and successful also. Some other places in Proverbs where it says this, chapter 10, verse 2. This is on the screen for you. Ill-gotten treasures are of no value, like we talked about last week, but righteousness delivers from death. Verse 3 of chapter 10, the Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, but he thwarts the craving of the wicked. Now verse 4, lazy hands make a man poor, but diligent hands bring wealth. These are the concepts we're going to see. And in this very verse, we're going to come back to some more of these later. He uses the two concepts in one verse. Verse 5, he who gathers crops in summer is a wise son, but he who sleeps during harvest is a disgraceful son. Now we're going to come back to this idea of disgraceful and sleeping in a few moments. In chapter 12, there's several verses in chapter 12 that talk about this concept of work and diligence. Verse 11 of chapter 12. He who works his land will have abundant food, but he who chases fantasies lacks judgment. You get the idea that if you're working, you'll be provided for, but if you're out just in la-la land, it's a foolish idea. Verse 24 of chapter 12. Diligent hands will rule, but laziness ends in slave labor. Verse 27, the lazy man does not roast his game, but the diligent man prizes his possessions. Chapter 14 of Proverbs says, in all toil there is profit, but mere talk lends only to poverty. You can see this phrase is being repeated throughout the Proverbs. I want to read us a lengthy section that Solomon would apply here in chapter 27 to the idea of if you're a diligent worker, this is what you do. Chapter 27, verse 23. Be sure you know the condition of your flocks. Give careful attention to your herds. For riches do not endure forever, and a crown is not secure for all generations. Verse 25, when the hay is removed and new growth appears and the grass from the hills is gathered in, the lambs will provide you with clothing and the goats with the price of a field. Now there's another place we're going to read in a little bit where Solomon gives us this idea of this is what a person who is modeling after the ant, this is what they do. They look after their herds, they care for them, and then eventually it pays off in the end. few weeks ago, well, a month or so ago, I was reading a book, and one of the chapters, and I've seen him do this in person. The author, well, they were quoting him in the book. It was a basketball player, and he was lamenting how younger basketball players, he's probably older than me, so he's, mid-50s, maybe in his 60s by now, and he was lamenting how this younger generation of athletes didn't work as hard as his generation did. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but it is certainly a stereotype. Every preceding generation believes that the younger following generation does not work as hard as they did. It's just the way life goes. And it may be true in some cases. It's not fair for us to judge a whole generation by that. But I think that's, even though the younger generation really hasn't had enough time to understand the concept and the value of hard work. They almost have to experience some hard times to realize if I had just worked ahead, if I had just stored some provisions earlier, I would be in a better position. And sometimes only experience can teach those things. So sometimes we need to give people an opportunity to work and to fail, to be lazy and find out what are the results of laziness versus the rewards of some hard work. What is the end result? And let them learn that on their own. When we're younger, we coast because we can, right? Our parents have been providing for us our entire life. We have really no concept of what is involved in having and required and having to live as an adult. Well, sometimes we have to fail between that ascension from youth to adulthood to realize what is really required of me. Ephesians chapter 4, some of the concepts from the book of Proverbs regarding work are affirmed by Paul in the New Testament. Ephesians 4:28. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. Paul uses it and says it also helps you to be generous. Go to work so that you can have not only for yourself, but for other people as well. And we talked about the concept of generosity last week. 2 Thessalonians, Paul again says in chapter 3, for even when we were with you, we would give you this command, if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. For we hear that some among you walk in idleness, not busy at work, but busybodies. Now such persons we command and encourage in the Lord Jesus Christ to do their work quietly and to earn their own living. Now, as I read this, my mind flashes back to being in elementary school, our textbook using these verses to talk about the development of the Protestant work ethic, right? And you know what that means. You've heard of that. If not, go look it up, because there's a whole section that I'm sparing you today that I was studying and reading this week about the Protestant work ethic. This concept that part of the Christian faith is the idea that we work hard and we are diligent about what we're doing. And you can talk about that and debate about it all you want. But that's the concept behind that. And that's our first principle for the day, is the value of hard work. Solomon says, look at the ant. Look how hard he works. This is something, go to the ant. This is something for you to model after. Now the second principle comes here in verses 9 through 11, still back in Proverbs chapter 6. Now let's go back. He brings up the sluggard again in verse 9. How long will you lie there, you sluggard? When will you get up from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a bandit, and scarcity like an armed man. Now that verse there, 10 and 11, are going to be repeated in the next section of verses that we're going to read. So we'll spend some more time. But this Hebrew word for sluggard here, it occurs 14 times in the book of Proverbs and nowhere else in the Old Testament. So when I was calling my fellow classmates a sluggard, I was quoting distinctly from the book of Proverbs, because that's the only place that the word appears. Look at verse 24. This is also the passage that we contrasted with what we saw earlier about caring for your flocks. Look at how Solomon describes the sluggard. Chapter 24, verse 30. I went past the field of the sluggard, past the vineyard of the man who lacks judgment. Thorns had come up everywhere. The ground was covered with weeds, and the stone wall was in ruins. I applied my heart to what I observed and learned a lesson from what I saw. And here's that verses again that we just read. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a bandit, and scarcity like an armed man. Solomon's warning is, if you stay in bed all the time, you're not able to be productive and do the things. Now this is something that you could just nail teenagers with, right? Get out of bed, you sluggard. Let's go to work. But let's be honest, as a teenager, you probably need more sleep than we do as an adult. At least it seems like that in my house. I have 3 teenagers in my house right now. Sometimes in the early morning hours. Now, I'm an early riser anyway. I like to get up. But in that 4-5 hours before my kids get up, I'm like, man, what a waste of the day. You know, they could be being so productive right now. I'm not criticizing them. I get it. I wanted to sleep too at that age. But Solomon says there's a point in your life to be productive. You got to get a jump start on the day. And I'm looking at all you people that are not morning people going, oh, you're not preaching now. Now you're meddling, right? I'm stepping on toes. That's what Solomon says. It's right here. So anyway, here's what a commentator says about this. Come work time, the sluggard always pleads for a little more rest, a little more folding of the hands. And he says apparently the common attitude of rest was to lay on one's back with the hands folded upon the chest, right? Like this. And you can just see a guy who's probably supposed to be working with his hat down over his eyes, right? And he's sleeping and he's got his hands like this. Because I have to admit, when I first read that idea, a little folding of the hands, I'm like, what is that talking about? Well, he helped me understand that a little bit more. There's another concept here that I want. This is actually a real world situation. I don't know if I've talked about this on the Facebook Lives or not. But there is this new trend in China. It's called Nanping. And it means literally in English, lying flat. Now it started with, apparently there's this group of elephants that wandered from the forest or the jungle in China, I suppose. And they have been like a hot media trend. And people have been watching them because they're just wandering around. You can watch some of the videos in a car lot. They're squashing chickens and things like that. But there was this idea behind that it was like a hot thing for people to do. And they just wanted to it began to encourage this movement about just living your life, doing whatever you want to do. Because let's admit, elephants don't seem to be the most diligent, hardworking creatures. Now, they can do a great amount of work, but Solomon didn't say, go to the elephant, thou sluggard. He said, go to the ant, right? So let me read you about this concept. It says, 5 years ago, this is in China, this guy quit his job in a factory. He biked 1,300 miles to Tibet, and he started working these odd jobs. And he called his new lifestyle lying flat, or tang ping in Mandarin. He wrote a blog and called it Lying Flat is Justice. And it went viral, and it became this broad statement about the Chinese society for millennials. Now, there's also not just younger generations in our culture, also in other cultures. So there's a younger Chinese millennial culture, and it describes it in this way. They're defying the country's prosperity narrative by refusing to participate in it. Foregoing marriage, children's jobs, and houses and cars. Now, we know that they live in a communist system which values the work and what a individual and a community can contribute to the party, right? So they push people to work and develop on all these things. And there's kind of this Nanping is a push back against that, right? And they're not pressing as hard as their predecessors did to fulfill all the wishes of the Communist Party would have for them. And they desire some simplicity, like the elephants. Says another article says the trend began after someone posted a manifesto and a picture of himself in bed, curtains sealed against the midday sun. The term took off online as Chinese millennials began defiantly napping and posting images of cute animals sprawled out, mascots for the Tang Ping spirit. Now you can see that maybe a sloth or something, just an animal just relaxing, maybe a cat, whatever it is, just being lazy. So they began to post these things, and it says, in the face of untenable work hours. Now they work a ton of hours, and they are encouraged to do so. In the face of untenable work hours and dwindling upward mobility, they didn't sense that they were getting anywhere by working harder. This was a movement of declining by reclining, excusing yourself from a rigged game. And you can imagine, as usual, that the Communist Party quickly scrubbed the term from the internet, and they forbid the selling of items that had these animals that were being lazy, because that's not a lifestyle that they wanted to encourage. They targeted the idea as a threat to stability. Eventually the forum had more than 200,000 members. And we get the idea. Now, I'm not saying that we need to work ourselves to a point of stress and overwork, but there is value that even the Chinese Communist Party would say there's a value to people getting out of bed and going to work and overcoming all those sluggish habits. Proverbs 19:15 says this, life collapses on loafers, or lazy bones go hungry. Chapter 18, verse 9. One who is slack in his work is brother to one who destroys. Now this is the one there's some variation in. The Message would say, slack habits and sloppy work are as bad as vandalism. And I'm surprised that the Communist Party, maybe this is a way to get scripture into the Chinese country, into China, to tell them that slack habits and sloppy work are as bad as vandalism. I could see that being a Communist Party message. Poet Robert Frost said this, and if you've ever worked anywhere, you realize this, that the world is full of willing people. Some willing to work, and the rest willing to let them. If you've worked anywhere, you've probably recognized who is who really quick. Everybody's willing. Some are willing to work, and some are willing to let others work. In chapter 6, as we're thinking about, you probably have a picture of some, or maybe a name of someone who comes to mind as I talk about that. In chapter 26, there's a section that gives us these vivid word pictures of this sluggard. It's a person who makes ridiculous excuses. In chapter 26, verse 13, it says this. The sluggard says, there's a lion in the road, a fierce lion roaming the streets. Now, when I read this verse, I can remember in elementary school reading this verse and thinking, wow, they have lions on the street in Jerusalem and in Israel? Well, there may have been, but it wasn't a common occurrence. The point is, the reason the sluggard doesn't want to go to work is he's making up a ridiculous excuse. Oh, there's a lion, I can't go out there, right? It is ridiculous, a concept. And so what Solomon does is he brings these humorous sayings regarding this slothful person, says they're full of excuses. And you probably know that person, the person who's looking for any excuse, even the most far-fetched thing to stay indoors and avoid work, right? There's a lion in the streets, I can't go out there. And you may have worked with that person. Look at verse 14, he gives us another example. As a door turns on its hinges, so a sluggard turns on his bed. And I thought, what is that? Because one is vertical and one is horizontal, right? As you think about this, the concept here is that a person who's lazy or slothful, they love sleep. And they toss and turn on their bed like the squeaking of a door hinge, right? If a door squeaks, when you can hear people turning over on the bed, that's the word picture that Solomon's creating for us. They never leave their bed to do any work. The door creaks when it moves, so the person who's still in bed, their bed creaks because they're still in it. Verse 15. The sluggard, this one always makes me laugh. The sluggard buries his hand in the dish. He's too lazy to bring it back to his mouth. He's avoiding the even slightest exertion. He's so lazy. He's got a fork full of food and he can't even bring it to his mouth. He's so lazy. Verse 16. The sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who answer discreetly. One of the commentators says this person is arrogantly opinionated. He's too lazy to undergo the mental discipline which would enable him to give an intelligent reply to discuss things. He just thinks he knows it all and has an answer for everything. You've probably met that person as well. Because he's too lazy to go out and do the work and understand what he's actually talking about. So he just makes up excuses and he flatters himself that he is able without study to contradict any argument that you have. So that's a lengthy section in chapter 26. There's a few verses, I'll just read them briefly here, that give us both of the concepts that we've talked about today, the idea of promoting work and discouraging laziness. Proverbs 20:13. Do not love sleep or you will grow poor. Stay awake and you will have food to spare. Chapter 13 verse 4. The sluggard craves and gets nothing, but the desires of the diligent are fully satisfied. And this is one of my favorite ones. This is from the Message, chapter 28 verse 19. It says, work your garden, you'll end up with plenty of food. Play and party, you'll end up with an empty plate. You can see that's the concept that we see over and over and over again in the book of Proverbs. To me, that's a great summary, and I wanted to include that one here. So as I was going through these verses this week, I realized, well, I'm talking to a congregation of people who have worked hard their entire life. How do I preach and be faithful to the Word of God and teach you all of it, and then just go, but you bunch of lazy sluggards, you got to get to work? Because I know that's not the audience that I'm speaking to. One of the first things they teach you as a pastor or a public speaker is know your audience. Consider who you're talking to. So I thought, so how do I come up with ways to apply this to us? So I want us to do that this morning and just remind you, first of all, this will be our first point of application, that God is glorified by a Christian living and working in His purpose, His or her purpose. Whatever it is that God has called you to do, He is glorified by you doing that. And you probably know what that is better than I do. But there is a point and a purpose to your life beyond just being a saved Christian. There's more for you to do. There's work to do here on earth. Beyond the pure means to provide for your family and provide for a retirement and all those sorts of things, there is something greater than just that in your work. God has given you a task to do, a place to do it, and a people to serve. The point of Proverbs is that work has value and a purpose beyond all those things. There is something of the holy in us working. We often believe that work is a result of the curse that happened in Genesis 3. Remember Adam and Eve sinned, and we think that Adam having to toil the ground. Well, I always think, what did they do before that? God certainly had something for Adam and Eve to do, as he does for us. Henry Ford, you remember the guy who modernized the assembly line and just made a killing out of understanding the concept of work and how it should work. He said this, "Work is the only pleasure. It is only work that keeps me alive and makes life worth living. I was happier when doing a mechanic's job." So when he advanced so far that he got to the place where he wasn't on the factory floor anymore and he had to do all the managing and all the administration, he says, "I was really happy just working every day for a living, being productive." One of the commentators says, and this is in your study notes this morning, one of the blessings of diligent labor is the joy of developing the kind of ability and character that others can trust, thereby making ourselves available and able to do the next responsibility that God has prepared for us. Think about the examples from Scripture. Joseph was faithful in suffering and service, and this prepared him to rule Egypt. David faithfully cared for a few sheep, and God gave him an entire nation to shepherd. Colossians chapter 3 says this, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for men." A lot of people in this world think, well, I just work for my boss or for my company. That's not who the Christian works for ultimately. Working for the Lord, not for men, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. Whether the value of your work is seen by the world or not, God is pleased by your diligent efforts, by your attention to detail, by your getting out of bed every day. Just as it's a struggle, and I realize some people really have a hard time getting out of bed in the morning. God blesses you and rewards you for getting out of bed and being here on a Sunday morning. He also does that every day you get up to serve Him and fulfill your purpose. So that's our first point of application, is that God is glorified by a Christian living or working in their purpose. The second one is this. I ran across another story. There was a philosopher, his name was John Dewey. You can look it up another time, but he was often prone to just thinking deep thoughts and trying to understand all these things. And he came home one day and he found his son in the bathroom, and the bathroom floor was flooded. So the professor begins to think, and the gears begin turning, and his son is watching him. And he's trying to figure out the situation. And after working a few minutes, the son said, "Dad, this is not the time to philosophize, it's time to mop." That's what I would say the second point of us. It's not time to think about all the things that God has called us to do. It's time to do them. As we go forward in engaging our community and back to school events and all those sorts of things, it's time to mop. It's just time to do those things. We can talk about service. We can philosophize about a lot of things that Scripture tells us, including work and laziness. But sometimes you just need to pick up the mop and get to it. We have in front of us today a world that is desperate for hope. And the more people that I talk to, the more pastors I talk to and run into the world, I'm going, they are so lost. That is the greatest descriptive term of the world that we live in today. It is so lost. And it is so confused and dark and despair. And it needs truth and hope and light. Christians, it's time to pick up the mop. We have the things that the world needs. Let's recommit ourselves to the work to be done. And I would challenge you with that this morning. And as we do that, let's go to the Lord in prayer.